One of my favorite third-party Resolve tools just got its biggest update ever, and no one on YouTube's even talking about it. This tool is free, it's easy to use, and it's going to help you get better grades and build better looks instantly. The tool I'm talking about is called OpenDRT. It's a DCTL. And even if you're already familiar with OpenDRT, you might have missed this latest update and all the cool features within it that we're going to be exploring today. I'm also going to show you the number one landmine thing that you need to look out for when you're working with this tool in Resolve. Okay, we got a lot to cover. We're going to start from zero today. I'm going to show you how to get this DCTL, download it to your computer, load it into your LUT folder, showing up in Resolve, and then we're going to get hands-on and take a look at what OpenDRT is, how it works, why we might want to use it over other solutions, and then I'm going to show you how I do use it in my professional color grading practice. All right, let's get started. I'm going to start by following the link that I've left for you guys in the description for this video, and this is going to take us to my friend Jed Smith's GitHub, who is the creator of OpenDRT. We're going to go up here in the upper right-hand corner and hit Download Raw File. Now, I want to save myself a step and point my download directly to the LUT folder where I need this to land. So if you want to do that with me, you can go to Resolve, hit Shift-9 to go to your project settings, and then go to Color Management, Lookup Tables, and then I'm going to say Open LUT Folder. And if you're on Mac OS, what you can do is pick up this folder, hold it down while you hit Command-Tab, go back to your browser, and just drop this into the dialog box that's popped up asking where you want to download the file to. When you do that, as you can see, it's going to point you right into that folder, and you can simply hit save. If that seems too fancy, or if you're on a system that doesn't work quite that same way, feel free to download this to your downloads folder and then move it over into your LUT folder, having found that LUT folder from within Resolve, just the way that we looked at a second ago. All right. So what you're going to need to do once you get this downloaded, if you're downloading it for the first time, you need to fully quit Resolve and then reopen it. You will not be able to see the DCTL until you do so, because Resolve indexes DCTLs when it first launches. All right, so make sure you close and then reopen Resolve if you're downloading this for the first time. In my case, I cheated a little bit. I actually already had OpenDRT installed, so I get to skip that step. Let's go back over to Resolve and start playing around with this thing. I'm going to hit Escape here, and we're going to be spending our time today here at the timeline level of the node graph for reasons that we'll talk more about in just a little bit. But for now, I'm going to add a serial node. I'm going to go to my effects up here in the upper right and look for DCTL. I'm going to drop this onto my new node, and I'm going to go to my DCTL list, which is going to be probably considerably longer than yours. Hopefully yours is shorter, so it's easier for you to find what you're looking for, which is going to be OpenDRT. Okay. Once we load this up, you can see it's doing its thing right off the bat, right? And it's especially helpful or useful if its defaults align with the way that you're grading, which is the case for me. I'm grading in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I've color managed all my images into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. So my default rendering here is exactly what I need. And that really is the first two settings that we can talk about within the plugin or the tool. We've got our input gamut and our input transfer function, DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. The next thing that we can take a look at would be our display encoding preset. Normally, this is exactly where I would want to be, Rec 1886, Gamma 2.4, Rec 709. In this case, because we're all hanging out here on YouTube, I'm actually going to flip this to sRGB so that it looks correct on our Gamma 2.2 displays. Okay, so that's our two kind of like basic bookends of OpenDRT. What are you giving me and what do you want me to give you back is essentially what OpenDRT is asking when we provide these parameters. But let's now go through a tour of some of the other key things that we want to be able to navigate when we're using the tool. And the cool thing about OpenDRT, one of many cool things that we'll talk about today, is it's very simple in terms of its UI and its operation. In fact, a lot of these first few options here, we don't even need to worry about, at least at first, at least while you're getting accustomed to the tool. You may get to a level of fluency with the tool and a level of customization with the outputs that you're creating that you want to start touching more of these sliders. But at a baseline, there's only a few we really need to worry about. So let's go through this from top to bottom and talk about what we need to worry about versus what we can safely leave at its default for the time being. Display peak luminance, you can totally leave this alone, especially if you're just working in SDR. You're not going to need to touch this except in specific edge cases. HDR gray boost and HDR purity, those are only going to apply if you're working in HDR. So again, you can leave those alone in most cases. Even if you're working in HDR, you don't have to touch them. You just are going to have an effect on your image if you do. Right now, if I move these around, nothing at all is going to happen. You can also see I've got these tool tips popping up here that are giving me some really helpful context for, hey, what the heck does this thing do and what do the different slider values represent when I move them around. So if you ever want a cheat sheet, you can just hover your cursor over any parameter here within OpenDRT. Creative white range, we're going to skip past this for now because I want to talk about it as a companion to our creative white down below. Next, we've got our clamp. That's on by default. That should be on by default. That simply means we're going to clamp everything below 0 and above 1, which our display isn't going to show anyway. So it's perfectly sensible to clamp those things off. We talked about our input gamut and transfer function. And here is where things get really powerful with OpenDRT. Look preset, tone scale preset, and our creative white. So let's talk about these for a minute. So with our look preset, you can see I've got these 4 default look presets that are quite distinct from one another. I've got my default, I've got colorful, I've got umbra, and I've got a base. These all have very different character, and they've all got a different philosophy or a different idea driving behind them, but they're giving us 4 very different baseline renderings of our image. Then if we look at our tone scale preset, this is fun because by default, the tone scale preset is controlled by the look preset. So in this case, I think the look preset is using the high contrast, which I can tell because when I change between these two, there is no change, but I can flip to something else if I want. I could do this marvelous tonescape or umbra or whatever I want to do, right? So I can actually have even more creative control over my image by separating out my overall look preset with the tone scale, essentially the way that I'm tone mapping my image onto the display by selecting something other than use look preset here. And we're going to play around with what that might look like in just a minute here when we get hands-on with some examples. Next, we've got our creative white. Creative white is going to give us the ability to bake in a warmer white point than the true white point of our display. Okay, so the white point of our display typically is D65. If I wanted to get a warmer white point, I could go D60. I'm going to drop it all the way to D50 just to give as much contrast as possible. And we're also going to evaluate this on a grayscale ramp so that you can see not just in the image, but on a plot, what happens when I do this. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. So let's set my waveform like so. And you can see my creative white at D65, everything converges together up and down the tone scale, right? Red equals green equals blue, all the way up and down. At D50, that's no longer true. Red's coming out on top, green's chasing after that, and blue is in the bottom position, right? So it's a really cool way of imparting some creative warmth or a non-D65 white point within your D65 container or your D65 display. And now we can look at our creative white range with much better context because we can see as I slide this to the right, it's reaching further and further down the tone scale so that now my creative white is really affecting basically every pixel from black all the way up to white, right? It's having more effect up here, but it really is affecting basically every pixel as opposed to all the way to the left where it's really just affecting more of the shoulder of the image. So creative white range effectively controls how much influence do you want that creative white point change to have up and down the tone scale. Over on the left, it's going to be quite little, and over on the right, it's going to be quite a lot, okay? And here's the cool thing, guys, like that's it. That's actually all you need to know in terms of like, what does it do? How do these sliders work? That's all you got to know in order to use OpenDRT and start experimenting with it and playing around with it. We're going to start experimenting with it and playing around with it in just a minute. But before we do, I want to show you something that is not immediately obvious that's important to understand when you're using OpenDRT and when you're choosing a DRT in general. By the way, I'm going pretty quickly through some concepts that are worthy of separate discussion, namely DRTs today. OpenDRT is a DRT. It's a display rendering transform. We just did a deep dive video on DRTs. So if I'm going too fast for you or you feel like you're missing the broader concepts here, definitely encourage you to go check out that video as a foundation for everything that we're covering here today. But if we take a look at the way that this DRT is going to work versus some other DRT, like a question comes up like, all right, so why am I downloading this like third-party thing and loading it into my LUT folder and relaunching Resolve and learning all these new parameters and stuff? Isn't this basically doing what a Resolve color space transform does? And the short answer is yes. In broadest terms, it is serving the same function. A Resolve color space transform can act as a DRT. That's typically what we use as our DRT if we are color managing inside of Resolve, right? And let's take a look at how this actually shakes out. Like let's go to this image here and let's just go back to our default for everything. So we've got kind of a good baseline image and I'm going to get rid of my grayscale ramp for now and grab a still. So this is a still of OpenDRT doing its thing to our image. Let's contrast this with the vanilla native version of our DRT that we could do right within Resolve. No downloading of anything necessary. That would be a Resolve CST, right? I've got this saved as a power grade here. But you can see it's a color space transform going from DaVinci Wide Gamma Intermediate to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. In this case, just like we did with OpenDRT, I'm going to flip this to Gamma 2.2. And let's just compare these two. So like, they're different, right? Like you might say, oh, I like that kind of thicker contrast, but you might also reasonably say like, what's the big deal? I'll do that in my color grade. That's not worth all this fuss over like all this third-party tool, download DCTL stuff that you're throwing at me, Colin, right? Here's the thing I want to show you. Here's what's important to understand about DRTs. DRTs can be tricky to evaluate on any one image because any one image only shows its own contents, right? Where a DRT by definition is a system tool. It is designed for many, many, many images and pixels to pass through it. So what we really want if we're going to fully evaluate a DRT is to see how it's going to handle not just the pixels in this image, but all possible pixels that could pass through it when we're using it to serve that function of our DRT. So let's check this out as the way we can do that. I'm going to use another really cool open source, totally free DCTL made by my buddy Thatcher Freeman called RGB chips. And RGB chips is going to allow us to look at all possible colors that might pass through this DRT. And you can see when we do this, what that looks like. We've got quite a bit of clipping where colors are kind of like gathering up and smashing into each other at the edge of the color wheel here. And there's things that were not obvious when we look at this one shot that are kind of obvious here that are like, that doesn't seem particularly graceful or like it's handling those higher luminance, higher saturation colors particularly well, right? Let's contrast this with OpenDRT. So I'm going to grab a still of this and we can wipe this out and let's grab OpenDRT as a alternative, like so. And let's compare the two. Very different story, right? Look at the vector scope and look at the image. The image has a very prominent, very noticeable path to white is often what that's called, meaning that as we are approaching like the top of our container, our colors are converging toward white, which we're going to see even a little bit later today, just how advantageous that can be. And you can also see on the vector scope, colors are being smoothly handled. They're not clustering or clumping together or getting mashed together too aggressively. So this gives us a better lens on like, okay, at a system level of all the possible colors that I might pass through this DRT, how's it going to handle that stress when I push higher saturations through it? And we can see that OpenDRT, even though it looks loosely similar to a Resolve color space transform with a lower, more moderate saturation set of colors in one particular image, it actually pulls out way ahead when we're looking at all the possible colors that we are sooner or later probably going to run through it over the course of one or many projects. Okay, so that's a really helpful just visual for me to recognize like, all right, they might look the same on one particular image or two DRTs might look kind of close, but they may be further apart than they really appear. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's get hands-on. We're going to look at some practical examples of how we might use OpenDRT and all of its flexibility to achieve some different outcomes when we're grading. All right, I'm going to wipe this chip chart out for now. We're going to go back to OpenDRT. And let's go to this first chunk of clips here. And I'm going to say for this first chunk of clips, I have a particular agenda in mind. I want to start with a very flat, very neutral image that leaves lots and lots of room for me to get creative and really do like a capital L, like looky look for these images. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. My look preset of default is good. I'm going to set my tone scale preset to ACES 2.0. Why ACES 2.0? Because it's really low contrast. I think it's actually lower in contrast than the low contrast option. Maybe not. Maybe ACES 2.0 has got a little bit more snap to it. Let's go with it for now and say that by any standard, this is quite a flat rendering of the image, right? Like a lot more is needed here to make this image look finished and fully graded and grab the eye, right? That's exactly what I want though. I want that room so that I can really push the way that color, the way that saturation, the way that contrast is coming into the image. Let's say I really want to control those things and exert authorship over them. This is a good foundation for that because there's lots of room for me to do those things. And the DRT is not doing much of those things before I even get my hands on the look or the images. Make sense? So what we're going to do now is a scene referred creative look. I'm going to use my look development plugin Contour. There's lots of different solutions you could do here. You could build a look yourself. You could use a scene referred LUT that you like or trust, or one that you've built yourself. I'm going to use Contour here, and I'm going to import a profile that I've saved for this exact purpose. All right, so check this out. That's a big old change, right? Like everything about this image is really changing when I do this. And this is a great opportunity to just quickly observe something that we've done here. I've got these two pieces in place here, right? These form a very important conceptual piece of the puzzle for our imaging pipeline. The most important piece of the puzzle, as a matter of fact. These form something that I call the print. The print is formed by our DRT in this case, and our creative look. So this is what I would call a two-step print. We don't always have a print that comes in two steps, but it's very common to have a print that comes in two steps in a modern color managed workflow. And it's common for those two steps to be exactly what we've just done here. Our DRT, which is generally a bit more technical and neutral, and our look, which is a bit more creative in nature. Okay, so we are doing a two-step print, and we are getting this very sort of like divided. DRT just does a really, really like light touch baseline thing. And then most of the preferential subjective stuff is happening here in my creative look. And you can see, like, without even knowing much about Contour, if you've never even seen the plugin before, I'm adding 40% contrast here. I'm pushing in like quite a bit of split toning, meaning cool into the bottom and warm into the top in this case. I'm adding quite a bit of saturation into the low end of the image here in my saturation module. I'm doing some split saturation. This is a new module that we've got coming out for the tool. So I'm really shaping the image. This color density, like this will be easiest to see like on one of these wides. Look at how much that's altering like the way these washing machines feel. So I'm really shaping out this image here in the look, and I was given the room to do this because of the way OpenDRT showed up for me and because of the light touch that it is taking with the parameters that I've chosen here, okay? So this is one way to go about things. If you want to do a big, bold, capital L look, you want to control the way color, saturation, contrast is rendered in the image, OpenDRT can accommodate that. It can give you a very conservative, low contrast, low saturation baseline where you can control a lot of that stuff in the way that it gets shaped out for the building of your final print, which again, I'll emphasize, we are conceptually and sort of process-wise dividing it up, but it's really just a thing that does a thing. So if we've got these two that we turn off and on, this is my print. The fact that it's formed of two components really doesn't matter, except to me as I'm doing it. But the ultimate result is this is what is printing my image and turning the ingredients into a rendered image, right? That's something that I talk about a lot when we think about the color grading process, and we think about color grading maybe as analogous to baking, okay? In baking, we've got our ingredients, we've got the skill that it takes to put those ingredients together and the amounts and the ratios and the way that we put them together. But then we've got an oven, right? The print, that is the oven. That is the thing that is going to make the ingredients into food. And in our case, the print is what's going to make our raw data or our graded data into an image. Follow me so far? Okay, cool. Let's take a look at another example here with some different images. Let's say in this case, I don't want to go for such a big, bold looky look. Like, I actually think this looks awesome still, but this might not be the right thing for every single project. This might need a more conservative look. We might be more in the mode that we're like, hey, I just want a good baseline. I just want a good, polished, popping baseline that I can begin to grade underneath once I've set it. I just want to keep it simple and set that baseline up. Here's how we could go about that. I'm going to get rid of my creative look altogether, and we're going to focus on how else we might use this DRT. Before I get rid of that look, actually, let's save it as a still. Now we're going to wipe it out. And here in OpenDRT, we're going to mix up our parameters and get a totally different rendering of the image when we do so. So for my look preset, I'm going to select colorful. Okay, that makes a small but noticeable change in terms of like the saturation of the image. But the big place where we're going to see a change is when I hit my tone scale preset and select ACES 1.x. ACES 1.x has a totally different tone scale than ACES 2.0, much higher in contrast, much more preferential than ACES 2.0, which is a bit more flat, a bit more neutral. But what's cool about what I just did here is that baseline that I just talked about of like, I just want something that looks good enough that I can start grading underneath it without getting too looky. We're there. We've got everything happening right now in one step. So remember, we just talked about our print and we just talked about a 2-step print. We now have a 1-step print. Everything's just happening in the DRT, and any other manipulation that we're going to make of this image is going to happen at the grading stage, at the individual shot level. So these are two very different approaches and pipelines to our image, and we have all this versatility from right within the same DRT. I really think of OpenDRT almost as more of what I would call a super DRT, in the sense that I would typically think of the DRT that we had that was driving this print as a different DRT than the DRT that we have that's driving this one, right? But what's cool about OpenDRT is they're just parameters. They're just options that we get to select from within the tool to get very different outcomes. So that's just two easy examples of the many, many different ways you can use OpenDRT to shape your print and to get your image rendering and looking really good on the screen for the foundation of the grade that you can undertake from that point forward. Now, I want to talk about the biggest gotcha, the biggest thing that you need to look out for when you're grading with OpenDRT. Thus far, we've looked at the presets for default and for colorful here. Let's take a look at the preset for a second for base. Base sounds pretty conservative, sounds pretty safe, right? But there's something we need to understand about base if you're going to use it, which, by the way, you totally can. I encourage using base for the right projects, but you need to understand what it's doing. So let's zoom in on this image and get that understanding right now. And what we're going to do is grab a still of this here, and then we're going to go to our tone scale, or rather our look preset, and go back to our default, okay? And then for our tone scale preset, we can actually leave that as is. So this is without even having a look in place, but I just want you to look at the difference between these two. This is our base look preset, and this is where we are right now. What difference do you notice? How does this feel comparing one to the other? Well, they're just different levels of contrast. For one, even though we've got the same basic tone scale preset, that contrast is actually coming from the way colors are rendered, and specifically, there's something happening with a more traditional RGB rendering like we're seeing here that is not happening with base. Base is designed to be more accurate, even more neutral than what we did a moment ago, but it's so like foundationally simple and it's taking such a light touch that it's not doing some things that we're just like kind of hard coded to expect in an image. And that's for the image to be more saturated in the bottom than it is in the top. Remember we looked at our RGB chips a minute ago and we saw that path to white that I called out? It's a similar thing here, except we don't have that path to white now. The colors are going to stay saturated as we climb. That might sound like something you might want, and I encourage you to play around with it, see if it does indeed lend an aesthetic benefit that you like. But what I see when I look at this is actually a idea that my friend Jed, who made OpenDRT, he introduced me to this term that I really like. He calls it chalky. So if you look at this rendering versus the base rendering we were on a moment ago, that base rendering has less separation between key side and fill side of her face. It kind of feels like she's been hit with like a cloud of chalk. Does that make sense? There's actually lower separation because in this rendering, I've got higher sat here, lower sat here. There's a contrast there. Whereas in this rendering, I have roughly the same level of saturation left and right. That's neither good nor bad. That's a fun thing to explore, but I will say that's something you want to be keenly aware of and either decide, hey, I like it, I want to go with it, or you need to have tools to control it and not expect your DRT to do it, which most DRTs are going to. This one will not. That's a good thing, but you need to know what to do about it if you want to get a little bit of that behavior of desaturating as you climb the tone scale still resident in your print, okay? Here's one way you could go about that, one very simple way if you want to experiment with this. I'm going to prepend a serial node. I'm going to go to my curves, and I'm going to go to my loom versus sat. And all I'm going to do is sample somewhere around the point where I would like to start bleaching things out. So somewhere like that, all right? And what I'm now going to do, I'm going to get rid of some of these excess control points and just drop things down and now start to move this control point around. And actually what I want to do, I'm applying this to the wrong state of image. Let's load up this other base profile rendering and paste that adjustment that we'd started to make here. And you can see, once I start getting the right shape on this thing, I'm going to begin to get that exact flavor that we're looking for, where we are desaturating as we climb toward white. What's cool about this is we can control the way that happens and how much of that we get. So it is an opportunity to exert more control, more authorship than if you're just getting that as a byproduct, as a default of your DRT, which is what you're going to get with like 9 out of 10 DRTs. So again, this base preset is actually super cool, but you got to know what it's doing and you got to know how to work with it. Otherwise, you're going to end up unintentionally getting this like very chalky, very low contrast, kind of weird feeling image. That's kind of the irony here, is that this is a more accurate to the original scene rendering of the image, but it feels weird to our eye because that's not the way we're used to seeing images rendered. So it's something, like I say, we need to be aware of and know how to work with. But once we are, it's a great fourth option to have within the presets that are available to us here within OpenDRT. So we just covered a lot of stuff about OpenDRT and about DRTs in general. But if you've held on this long, you've managed to get a really good overview of OpenDRT, the way it works, how we can get it loaded into Resolve, how it's different from a native solution like a Resolve CST, and the different ways that we might practically use it in our workflows to more quickly, more consistently get better looking images. And along the way, we've ended up getting a really good contextual exploration of the concept of a print and of the role that the DRT plays within that print. And I'm going to leave you with this. The imaging pipeline, the most important ingredient within that pipeline is your print. Remember my analogy. If color grading is baking, the print is your oven. It's what turns ingredients into something that can be eaten. The print is what turns your graded elements into something that can be viewed. The print, its most ingredient, is your DRT. So if you have a DRT that is more versatile, that handles edge cases better, that gives you more options in terms of what it allows you to do, that's going to have a huge impact on your color grading and how quickly, consistently you can achieve your grades and how good those grades are actually going to look. So go download OpenDRT, play around with it, drop a comment, let me know what you enjoyed about this video, let me know what questions you have about anything that we discussed, and we'll see you here for the next video.